I'm going to start off by just quickly drawing this cube. And once I have this constructed, I'm going to add color. I'll reduce it a little bit and move it over toward the left a little. And now I'm going to bring in a rough color sketch that I did. And as you can see, it's in black and white, or grayscale. And I'll be using that in combination with this cube. This video is all about highlights and shadows. And unfortunately, artists that teach don't talk enough about highlights and shadows. They leave out so many important things that the student must know about. One of the common difficulties of the painter is to master the intricacies of highlight and shadow. It is helpful to know that to the eye, highlights appear opaque and shadows appear more transparent looking. When you're working with light, you need to first of all know what the color of the object is to be, and that color is its local color. The local color is the actual color of the object, unaffected by light and shadow. I'm going to give this cube a local color of orange. So therefore, I'm going to cover the entire cube with an orange color. So right now, this orange cube is unaffected by light or shadow. And it displays its true color, which is orange. What I'm going to do to the cube, I'm also going to do to this painting here. And what I'll do is add orange over the entire painting of this spacecraft. So this spacecraft, just as with the cube, is unaffected by light and shadow. Not showing any detail, any variations of tone or any other shapes, except just this one overall orange shape. Just as what you see here with the cube. By knowing what happens to the cube, you'll know what is going to happen to this spacecraft and to the rest of the painting as well. So with the cube, you see it in very simple terms, and then you see it in more complex terms as applied to more complex forms. I'm going to reduce the opacity of the cube a little bit so that I can see the lines of the cube, so I'll know where to paint. And then on the spacecraft, I'll reduce the opacity of that as well, so that I can see the spacecraft underneath all that orange paint, so I'll know where to paint, like that. Now I made an addition here, which you can see, and that is the color wheel. Now, I have the local color, but now I need to establish a light source. So when you select the light source, decide on what the color of the light source should be. Should it be white light, or maybe light that has some yellow in it? I'm going to select a light that has some yellow in it, but not too much yellow, so I'll add a little bit of white to the yellow. A light that's something like that. See a little tinge of yellow there. So that's the next thing you need to decide on. What is the color of the light? If you look down here, you can see that I added color or light, and you need to decide on how strong the light should be. What is the intensity of the light, and where is the light coming from? Direction of light. So these three things you need to consider when deciding on a light source. So my light is coming from above and to the left, and is falling on this local color, which is orange. Another thing to consider, which I added right there, is the temperature of the light, which means, is that light source warm, which it usually is. but sometimes you may have a cool light source, like a cool bluish light. Determine how strong that light will be. Intensity of light, as I mentioned, in my case, it's going to be a strong sunlight. It can be a weaker light, which would put everything in more dim illumination or bright illumination, like what I'm going to indicate here. So all these things need to be taken into account when working with light. That part of a form that is closest to the light source will receive most of the light. So therefore, with this cube, this top plane is that part of the form that is closest to the light, and therefore it will receive most of the light. In my painting here, the light source will be up here somewhere. See, right there? On the right side rather than on the left side, like with the cube. So the light is shining down on the spacecraft from the right. Now take a look at the color wheel here. This is where the orange color is. Now, since the cube is orange and the light source is yellow, the top plane of this cube, that part of the form closest to the light source, will be tinged with the color of this light source, which is yellow. Therefore, this orange color is going to change somewhat. Now, how is it going to change? It's going to change by jumping up or shifting toward the top of this color wheel to the color next to orange, which is this one, and that's yellow-orange. That's what happens in sunlight or in comparable light. The color will shift to the color above it on the color wheel. Depending on how much color there is in the light source, that is it a weak yellow? Is it a very saturated yellow? Will determine to what degree that part of the form that is receiving the light will change. How much it will shift to the color above it on the color wheel, which in this case, as I mentioned, is the yellow-orange. So that will determine how much yellow-orange this top plane is going to receive, whether more yellow-orange or less yellow-orange. It all depends on how much color there is in the light source. So, since the light source here is a weaker yellow, this orange is only going to be tinged a little bit with this yellow, shifting it only a little toward the yellow-orange, which means that only a tinge of the yellow will mix with the orange color, and thereby change that orange color to one that has some yellow in it. So I can pick up this orange, this yellow-orange here on the color wheel, and then add it to that orange, or I can pick up the yellow from the yellow light source here and add that to the orange to change that orange color a little bit. But remember, it doesn't become a strong yellow-orange like you see in the color wheel here, unless the light source is a very strong yellow, thereby changing that orange to more of a yellow-orange. So it could change that orange color completely if that light source is a strong yellow or very saturated yellow. So right now you can see that the orange color has changed somewhat and is leaning a little toward the color above it on the color wheel. This plane here is in the halftone area, as it's called. It's a halftone because it falls between the lightest part of the cube, and then when I add shadow over here, it'll be the darkest part of the cube. So the halftone falls between those two values. And it is here at the halftone where you get to see the true color of the form, where the local color of the form can be seen. Because this part of the cube receives less light than the top plane of the cube, because that top plane is closer to the light source. And this plane is a bit further away, and therefore it receives less light. And because this plane is a vertical plane, it's oriented vertically to the light source and at an angle to the light source. It's not in the direct path of the light source like this top plane is. This top plane is exposed more to the light than this side plane is. And therefore this side plane is not affected by the color or intensity of the light as much as the top plane is. And that's why this part of the form has the actual local color and is just affected by the light source a little bit. It just changes it ever so slightly, not as much as the top plane is changed. So it's actually that color that receives less light, or that plane, or that part of the form that receives less light, where a more saturated color is found. And is found, as I mentioned, at the halftone. And you can see that this color is more saturated than this one. That one at the top has been drained somewhat of its color because of the intensity or strength of the light falling on that color. So the color is actually desaturated somewhat by the strength of the light falling on it. But since this part of the cube doesn't get that intense light, more of what the actual color of the form is can be therefore seen, and a more saturated color. So intense light actually desaturates the color. It doesn't make the color more saturated, it makes the color less saturated. Very important to remember. And now, coming over here to my spacecraft, I'll do to the spacecraft what I did to the cube, and I'll add this color that has been changed by the color of the light a bit toward the yellow-orange, something like this. I'm just roughing it in, as you can see. So already, this spacecraft is changing in its appearance due to the light shining on it and the color of the light. So on my spacecraft, I have the orange here, which is more saturated, more intense, while the color in the light has been desaturated somewhat, just like in my cube here. Right now, this cube, as well as my spacecraft here, do not look three-dimensional. In order for a form to look three-dimensional, it needs three different colors. The color in the light, the color in the halftone, as it's called, that part that is not receiving any light, not direct light, that is. This side plane is still in the light, but it's not receiving direct light, and therefore you can see the actual color of the object, the local color. But then there is another part of the form that is opposite of the light source, which is, of course, the shadow. And this is where the shadow will be placed. So once I have those three different colors, the light, the local color or halftone, and the shadow, the cube or the form will then appear three-dimensional looking. And so will my spacecraft once I apply those different colors. As the light on an object swings into shadow, two things happen. First of all, the hue, which refers to the name of the color, like a green hue, a red hue, an orange hue. The hue of the shadow also shifts to the next adjacent color on the lower side of the color wheel that you see here. So therefore, since this cube has a local color of orange, which is this, the shadow color is going to have some of the color that is below this orange on the color wheel, which is this color, and that color is red-orange. So the shadow will have some of this red-orange within the orange color. And therefore, the color of the shadow will shift a little toward the red-orange. But not so much that the shadow then appears like a pure red-orange, which would destroy the illusion of a orange cube, because this part of the cube will have a color that looks completely different from the rest of the color of the cube. The whole cube needs to have the appearance of it being orange, even in shadow. But of course, it's not going to be the kind of orange that you see here in the midtone or local color. It's going to change somewhat because it's in the shadow. Now, not only does the hue change somewhat in the shadow, but also the value. The value drops. It is lowered somewhat in the shadow. It's not as light as the value here where the halftone is, or local color. There are going to be three different values, and those three different values are also necessary to create the illusion of a three-dimensional form. So you're going to have a light value, then you're going to have a middle value, and then you're going to have a dark value for the shadow. So you have three different colors, and you have three different values, which create the illusion of a three-dimensional form. Now, in addition to what I've said about the shadow color itself reduces in intensity. You can't have a shadow that looks just as intense in color as does this part where the local color can be seen. This part has a saturated color, but the shadow has a color that is somewhat desaturated. But that doesn't mean that you desaturate the color to the point where it doesn't have any color in it anymore and where it just becomes a dull, lifeless looking color. A shadow color also has color, but the intensity of that color is somewhat reduced when you compare it to the color in the light and the color that is in the halftone or the local color. So that part of the form that has the least amount of intensity of color is found in the shadow. But as I mentioned, shadow also can have color. Don't make your shadows dull and dead and dirty and dingy looking. Now, another thing that needs to be considered is color temperature. There will be different temperatures of color on a form. The form doesn't have all the same color temperature. The warmest part of the form, the warmest color, will appear on the form that is closest to the light, and in this case it's this top plane. Then that part of the form that is facing away from the light, that is not receiving light directly onto it, like this top plane is, will be cooler in temperature. And then the shadow will have the coolest color. So therefore, this local color or mid-tone color that is not receiving direct light will fall between the warmest and the coolest color, and therefore this color is considered a halftone color. It's neither as cool as the shadow or as warm as the light, the form in the light. Now I'm going to add the shadow color, and as I mentioned, the shadow is of a darker value, therefore I need to lower the value of this orange color, and maybe something like this. Now since I'm working with the computer and not mixing paints, black is being applied to darken that orange. However, there's not so much black in that orange color that it becomes completely desaturated of color. If I move the little circle over toward the left, now you can see that that orange has been desaturated to such a degree that you can't even see that there's orange color in that desaturated color. But once I come over toward the right, adding more of the orange color, the color is somewhat saturated. It has been desaturated, but not to the point like this, where you lose the color entirely, or almost entirely, where it looks too dull and dirty. So I'm coming over toward the right, where I know that the value is lower, and the color has been desaturated, but not completely desaturated. There's still some orange in this desaturated color, so that the color appears richer than it does when I add more black to the color, desaturating it too much where it becomes a dull looking color like that. So shadow color is saturated to a certain degree. It has a certain intensity, but not as intense as the color in the light or in the halftone. So maybe that color will do. I'll test it out and see. That looks good. And now I'll add a little bit of that color below it on the color wheel, which, as I mentioned before, is the red-orange, because the orange does shift a little toward the red-orange in shadow. So I'll add a little bit of that, but not so much that it turns the color orange into a completely different color for the shadow. Like this. Now the shadow color still appears as though it has saturated color. It's not a dead, dirty, dull-looking shadow color. But it's not as saturated as this color that is receiving light, but not directly. The only part of this form that is receiving direct light is this top plane here. The color of a shadow cannot be a color that doesn't contain some of the color of the local color of the object or form. So in this case, of course, the shadow contains orange because that is the local color of this cube. Now, when you look at the cube as a whole, even though it has different looking colors, it basically looks like an orange cube, because the colors haven't changed so radically that they no longer give the total impression of an orange cube. So when it comes to shadows, you can't have a shadow on an orange cube, for example, that looks like this. And this is a shadow that doesn't contain any of the local color of the cube. Let's say there was a blue light over here, a weaker light than this one. That light, the main light, is referred to as a key light, while a weaker secondary light like this blue light is called a kick light. Now, if this kick light were shining into this orange color shadow, the two colors would mix and produce a neutralized orange color, like that. Now you no longer see the orange color because the color has been neutralized by the blue, because blue and orange are complementary colors, and when you mix the two complementary colors together in equal amounts, they neutralize each other and you end up with a neutral grayed color, like this. But what I'm going to do now is make a change here, and I'll start adding color to this grayscale. I'll pick up the color from the cube in the shadow, but I think that might be a little too saturated and a little too light, so I'm going to darken the color and gray it a little more. And so I'll just color this grayscale by going over it with that color for the shadow, like this. This is the fastest way to do this. And now for the local color, the color in the light, but not receiving light directly, which is, of course, this part here of the cube. So I'll add that, but that's a little too dark, so I need to make a change. See what that looks like. Still a little too dark. Go lighter. No, no good. So I'll add a new layer and then paint on that new layer. I was using the blending mode color layer for the shadow that I applied, but now I'm using a normal layer, and now I'm getting this lighter, more saturated color, like on my cube here. And then I need to add color for that part of the spacecraft that is receiving direct light, which is this part, and that part up here on my cube. So I'll pick up that color from the cube and see what that looks like. That may be good. You can see that the spacecraft is getting some dimension now from these different colors that I'm adding. Now I'm going to add what is called a cast shadow, and that's a shadow that is cast by the object or form, and I'm going to place that cube, I think, on a red surface. So the cast shadow will be added to this red surface upon which the cube rests. The cast shadow is darker than the surface upon which it falls. Therefore, I need a darker value than the value of this red. I'm going to go to the color picker and reduce the intensity of the color as well as lower its value. Something like this maybe. So it's a darker version of the red, like this. A darker, grayer version of the red. The surface upon which the cast shadow falls is red. Therefore, the cast shadow will also be red, but a darker and grayer version of the red. Now, within the cast shadow, there are other colors that may occur. Usually, there is a tinge of the complementary color of the light source within the cast shadow. So if the light source is yellow, which it is in this case, the complementary color of yellow would appear within the cast shadow. And the complementary color of yellow is violet, and you can see that right here on the color wheel. There's yellow and there's violet. Complementary colors are opposite each other on the color wheel. So there's a tinge of violet that will appear within this cast shadow. Just a slight touch of the violet, like that. Sometimes you can exaggerate the color of the cast shadow so that it appears more like the complementary color of the light source, which means that if I wanted to exaggerate this color, it would appear more like a violet. So I have to get the right mixture in there, like this. That's a little too saturated, so I would reduce the saturation somewhat. And even more. Something like that, maybe. I'm not going to exaggerate the cast shadow to that degree, however, so I'll go back to the way it was before, and now I'll just finish adding that tinge of the violet color to that red that's there, changing it slightly, like that. Now, shadows need to appear transparent looking, and the way you get a cast shadow, for example, to look transparent is to add darker values to that dark cast shadow. So if I did something like this, for example, where I just added some spots like this, that already helps to give a greater impression of a transparent shadow. And then right there at the edge where the cast shadow begins, that is where its darkest part is found. It's usually called the crack. Really dark. Now the cast shadow becomes lighter as it gets further away from the object casting it. So therefore, I need to lighten that shadow somewhat here. And actually, it also gets a bit brighter in color, more saturated. Now, the edges of a cast shadow should not be really razor sharp. If you do that, then the cast shadow looks less like a shadow. So it needs to have just a little bit of a soft edge. The hardest edge, however, appears here at the beginning of the cast shadow. And then as the cast shadow moves further away from the object casting it, the edge gets softer. I'm softening it now, as you can see. And it gets softer and softer the further it gets away from the object casting the cast shadow. Now, if there's a blue sky, like that, that blue sky will be reflected into the cast shadow. So therefore, some blue needs to be added to the cast shadow as well. Cast shadows can become very complex in their color. Now, right here where the cast shadow begins, as I pointed out to you, that darkest part occurs, but there's a larger, darker area, like this, at the beginning of the cast shadow. And then the cast shadow gradually gets lighter as it moves further away from the object casting it. And I need to darken that crack even more. Like that. And soften the edge a little bit. Shouldn't be too hard. And then I can add some of those darker spots that help to give a feeling of transparency to the shadow. Now the edges of the cast shadow, right there and there, are usually darker than the central part of the cast shadow. That part is usually lighter. So I'll darken the edges a little bit. And I think I'll leave it at that. Now the conjoined shadow, that shadow that is part of the form, this one here, is called the conjoined shadow. Another name for that shadow is the form shadow. I'll call it the conjoined shadow. That shadow is going to receive some of the reflected light of the surface upon which the cube rests. So it's going to receive some of this red color. It's going to be reflected into that shadow. So the red mixes with the orange. And what happens is that the grayed orange conjoined shadow mixing with the brighter red color will then become more saturated, and the color will appear more red because the surface that is reflecting that color into the shadow is red. So therefore the shadow is going to have some of that red in it. Now right here at the edge where the light turns to shadow, that part is going to be darker. So I'll pick up that shadow color and then darken it. I have to add a little bit of the red-orange to that shadow to get the right color. Remember, the color drops down on the color wheel, one color from the color of the object. Made a few adjustments to the cast shadow, and you can see the blue of the sky right there being reflected into the cast shadow. And I think I'm going to darken this part of the conjoined shadow on the cube even more. And by darkening that part, this part becomes lighter in value due to the reflected light being bounced into that conjoined shadow of the cube. And I'll add some of the red-orange color to this shadow, like I did before. And the shadow gets lighter as it moves further away from this edge, like that, due to the reflected light being cast into the shadow. So these are the things that happen within shadows. Also, nearby objects, such as this surface on which the cube is resting, will reflect their color into the shadow. However, even though reflected light occurs within shadow, some of it also can occur on the local color or mid-value of a form such as this color here. So a little bit of the red would be reflected into that color as well, but not that much. Just a slight tinge of the red, something like that. Not as much as within a shadow, like here. The red wouldn't be as luminous here as it would appear within the shadow. Now, coming over here to my spacecraft, the cast shadow can be seen right there. So the surface on which this spaceship is resting is a red surface. So I'll add red, but it's not going to be as bright as the red over here where the cube is. By making the ground a more muted red and the spacecraft a more saturated color, it stands out better against that more muted red or grayed red, darker grayed red. And now I'll add an even darker grayed red to the bottom of the spacecraft for the cast shadow. And to make it appear more luminous, or transparent rather, I can add some really dark spots in there. See, like that, there could be little stones. And now it's time to add highlights to this cube. When light falls on forms, highlights occur. And the highlights that I'm going to be adding are called specular highlights. And these highlights occur on smooth, shiny surfaces, and they're rather strong in appearance. Later in the video, I'll be showing you exactly how these highlights are constructed and what their color is, but for now, I'm just going to add a bright specular highlight running along this edge here, where the planes meet, where there's a change of plane. It's like this, the top plane, and then it changes right there at the edge to that vertical plane, and that's where the highlight occurs. And then I'll add the brightest part of the highlight right there, and then it seems to just fade out a little bit as it gets further away from that bright spot. Now I'll pick up this highlight and add it to the spacecraft. Right around this area here, I'll add a bright highlight right there, and a specular highlight here, and another one there, and one there. You can see how adding these highlights now increases the feeling of a solid three-dimensional form and gives a more realistic appearance to this spacecraft. So highlights are very important in increasing the feeling of a solid three-dimensional form. What I'm going to do now is increase the saturation of the color on the ground a little bit, right there. And by doing that, that brighter color is going to be reflected into the shadow side of the form, the lower part of the form will receive the color of the ground. That color will be reflected into the lower part of the form, while the upper part of the form will receive the color of the sky. So if the sky is blue or green or yellow or whatever it is, that color is going to be reflected in the upper part of the form. So I'll pick up that blue and then add a little bit of it to the upper part of the form right there, and then down here I'll add a little bit of that brighter red color into the shadow like that. So it's the lower part of a form that receives the color or reflected light coming from the ground or from the lower part of the picture, while the upper part of the form will receive the color or reflected light from the sky or from colors that are above it. Then, of course, reflected light will also occur because of forms that are next to that form. So if I have a green object over here, some of that green is going to be reflected also into this part of the shadow. So quite a few colors could occur within a shadow because of all these different colors reflecting their light into the shadow part of a form. So there's the color of the ground being reflected into the lower part of the form. Then there's the color of the sky being reflected into the upper part of the form. Then there is the color that is in other parts of the picture, such as this green, and it's being reflected into the shadow part as well. So you have color coming in from all different directions within the shadow, reflecting their color into the shadow. All of this color being reflected into the shadow helps to add color variety to a shadow and relate that object to its surroundings better. There is a connection or a bond formed with its surroundings, creating a greater sense of unity also, because that color within the environment is being repeated within the object or form. Remember what I said about the cast shadow over here, that it can receive the reflected light from the sky. So the sky reflects its color into the cast shadow. Sometimes the entire cast shadow can be blue like this. You'll see artists doing this. They'll color the whole shadow blue because there's a strong reflected light coming from the blue sky. And what I can do over here in my sketch, my color sketch right there where the cast shadow is, I could add some blue like this. So some of that blue that you see here in the sky is being reflected into that cast shadow. And that blue in the cast shadow also helps to create a greater feeling of transparency. And then I can add a few dark spots here to increase that feeling of transparency. And now I think it's time to move on. I'm going to show you a different form and how light falls on that form and how color changes. And then I'll be talking about the construction of a highlight and what color highlights are